Hey everybody, it's Kyle Jetzel, the Driven Autism Dad. So today I saw another video of a lady who was put herself online and was saying the worst thing about having a son on the autism spectrum is fighting for his rights. And I'm gonna share with you something that might kind of tick you off a little bit, but it needs to be said. And it's something that my wife taught me prior to her passing that has really changed my life, and it's changed the life of my sons. And I'll tell you what that is. And it's you got to stop fighting for your kids' rights, and you got to start loving for your kids' rights. And let me give you an example. I'll give you a couple of examples. Um, the first one is, back in the day when my kids were quite a bit younger, we'd have these IEPs, and my wife actually asked me to go with her to one of these IEPs to kind of take notes. And I said, well, do you want me to, this is back when I was a fighter, right? Fighting for my kids' rights and privileges and fighting and fighting and fighting, right? And I said, you want me to be there to scare people? You want me to talk to, you want me to, and she's like, no, 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 you just listen. I don't want you to say anything. Just take notes. And I want you to, and just take notes. Because she said, I can't really discuss these things with them and take notes at the same time. It's too much for me. So just take notes. I just want you to be there for me. And so we got in there, and I'd heard so many bad things about IEPs from all these people and how you have to fight this and fight that, and they don't want to give you services and all these kind of things. And I sit there and I watched as my wife, everybody came in the room, and there was more people than I expected. And I'll tell you why after I tell you the story. The first thing she said is they got started, and she said, I want all you guys to know how much I appreciate what you do for my son. He feels loved here, and I know it's because you care about him. And I know you've chosen. I didn't choose this life. This my son is hard to deal with sometimes. He's aggressive. He can become violent. He does crazy stuff sometimes, and I know that you chose this and I didn't. And I just want you to know how much I appreciate how you care for him, and that I know he feels loved here. And I thank you so much. I just want to tell you that before we get started. And I watched as every person in that room, just like me right now, got emotional. And then I watched as she kindly talked to them and requested and asked in the kindest way possible for all these services. And they did, I'm telling you right now, they made concessions for my wife. They did things that they wouldn't have normally done because of how she approached them. She was so kind and so loving and so sweet that they wanted to do everything they possibly could. And she told them, she said, I realize you guys have a lot of kids and you're limited in what you can do. But if there's any way that you could help me with this area and in this area, I can't tell you how much that would mean to me. And these people in this room, from the top to the bottom, pushed as hard as they could to give her everything that they possibly could. And it was amazing to me to watch this. And as we left, I said, "Holy crap! I didn't expect that. I expected it to be combative. I've read about all these IEPs and I've seen all these things." And she said, "My wife said to me, you know what, Kyle? These people have a hard job. I mean, I know how hard our kids can be, and maybe yours can be hard, and they can quit. They chose this." And she said, "I just want them to know how much I appreciate them, and I really do." And she said, "It just so happens that when you treat them with kindness and with love, and you show them how much you appreciate them, you get so much more. And it was really an eye opener for me in that moment because I had been conditioned to fight for everything, to fight for for fights for my kids on the spectrum. I fight for my family. I had to face battles that other people didn't have to, and all that fighting, I think, had made me kind of bitter and unhappy. And I've seen it in a lot of other parents. And I just want to tell you, there's a better way. I'll never forget, a friend of mine came to me one time and he said, Kyle, this whole autism thing has made you bitter and mean. And I said, what are you talking about, man? And he said, I've watched how tough it is for you and for a long time now, and you've had some hard things to overcome. And I get it, right? He said, I get it. It seems to me that you've kind of become a jerk and an a-hole, and you're just nasty sometimes. And I get it. And he said, but you justify that behavior because you're fighting this war to protect your sons that really just can't protect themselves. And I got to thinking about this, and it really kind of made me mad initially, but he's a good friend of mine and he knew me. And so I said, really, tell me more, right? And it was kind of ticking me off a little bit, but he said, I've watched you be forced to fight for your family, but I can see that it's kind of changed your personality. And he basically said, hey, I'm not saying it wouldn't happen to me either. I mean, I get it, right? I'd probably end up just like you if I were constantly fighting a war for my kids all the time. And he said, I get it. You've got a good reason. He said, but do you really think that walking around on edge and looking for people to offend you or your kids or finding reasons to lash out, even if it's justified, do you really think that's good long-term for your family? Right? And it got me to thinking about the fact that it had changed me. I was bitter. I was angry. I was frustrated. And this video that I watched this morning of this lady reminded me of that, right? The fight can turn us into somebody we don't want to become. And there's a better way than fighting. My wife was a lover, not a fighter. And, so I presented this to her and I said, Shelly, am I bitter? Am I angry? And she said, yeah. She said, you're really not helping in some cases. And I said, what can I do? And she said, well, you kind of need to check yourself. And I said, well, how do you check yourself, right? I mean, I've got to do it. And she said, you know what? You don't have to fight for them. You have to love for them. And she said, you have to really change your perspective on this thing. And so, I started to take a look at some of the side effects that that fight had created for me. And I noticed that it had made me kind of a bitter and angry dude. And it had driven away some friends. And sometimes I was grouchy and grumpy and unhappy and generally just kind of hard to get along with. So, um, I noticed I didn't want to be that way. I wanted to be more like my wife, right? Sorry, I'm emotional, but this is one of the most powerful lessons she ever taught me was you don't advocate, and I spelled it H-A-T-E, advocate for your kids on the spectrum. You have to love for your kids on the spectrum. You have to love those people that are serving them. You have to be kind to those people that are trying to help. And she definitely got more. You can't believe the things that she pulled off because of her kindness and her sweetness. There's my son, my oldest son, who's on the spectrum more severe, is now 23 years old. And every summer, one of his aides will call us. She doesn't have to do this. And she says, can I take Eric out with my family to go do something? And she does it because of my wife. I know that my wife sat there and told her how much she appreciated it. And she felt that in her heart. And she still reciprocates that. Eric feels so loved by her because my wife made her feel loved. So here's the really cool part as I started to kind of think through some of the ways I was being bitter and angry, it started to change me, right? And I started to try to move away from advocate, H-A-T-E, right? And really advocate in a spirit of love for them, in a spirit of love for those who serve them, in a spirit of love for the services they received. And it started to change me and it started to change my world. And I noticed that the world around us was kind of the same, but our world started to change drastically, and that was for the better. So, what I want to do real quick is challenge you and say, if you find yourself, and I'm gonna ask you some questions, and they're going to be kind of harsh, and I know I'm going to upset some people here, but I want to challenge you to join with me. And I wrote these down. Okay, so if you find yourself angry at even minor things, you should probably check yourself. Okay, you're bitter and you're angry and you're frustrated all the time, and it's because of the fight for autism services. That you don't stop fighting, start loving. If you find yourself disliking people in general and wondering why they're so commonly stupid, we need to check ourselves. If we find ourselves holding grudges or wishing ill on others, we've got to check ourselves. If we find ourselves internally jealous of other people or wishing our lives were easier, then we've got to check ourselves. If we find ourselves making no change to how we're acting and what we're doing, and, and wondering why we still have it so hard, we should probably check ourselves. If we find ourselves unhappy around cheerful people and annoyed because we think they're fake, then we should probably check ourselves. If we find ourselves unwilling to enjoy other people's success, then we should check ourselves. One of the things that I loved about Shelley is when she saw somebody succeeding, she celebrated. She celebrated for them. She was so sweet and kind and loving that she wanted other people to achieve and to be happy and to celebrate. And when you can start to do that, it changes the way you view other people, and it takes the bitterness out of you. And if we find ourselves talking bad about others and spreading gossip, we should check ourselves. And you can see, all these things were things I was doing. You can see how kind of bitter and angry I was, and it was because I was fighting for everything. Right, the fight had turned me into a fighter instead of like my wife, who was a lover. And once I started to make that switch, if the war for advocacy and acceptance, it can shape us in a lot of ways. If it's making us bitter and mean, we're hurting ourselves and we're hurting our families, and especially we're hurting our kids on the spectrum. And that's harsh, and I know it is, but that's the truth. Your kids deserve better. Your family deserves better. You deserve better. One of the things that I realized when I quit fighting for everything was that fighting is exhausting. You just always feel like you're fighting, right? And it's just exhausting. But what's really cool is when you start doing things for the right reason and loving, when you start advocating with love and kindness, it's builds you up. It makes you feel so good, right? The exhaustion is gone. You don't have to fight for this stuff. You're better off loving for these things. And I know that's going to rub people the wrong way, but try it, test it. And if this makes you mad or bitter, that's not my intention. My intention is to make you think, if you don't believe me, try it. The next time you have to deal with somebody and you feel like you got to go in and fight for something, decide right now, I'm going to go in and I'm going to love. And I'm going to tell these people how much I appreciate them. And I'm going to show them kindness and compassion. I know other people need it too. We're not the only ones that need it. Watch what it does to them and watch how it makes you feel. The exhaustion goes away when you stop fighting. And what replaces it is a love for others and a kindness and a compassion. And I'm so grateful. My wife not only taught me that, but drilled it into me. Right? Eventually it worked, right? And I became a lover like she is, and not a fighter, right? I still have to go through the same things everybody else does, but it's so much less exhausting now. It's so much more uplifting when you go into these things You can advocate with love and kindness and compassion. And this is the same thing we should be doing with our kids. So I challenge you, if you feel like the fight is beating you down, if you feel like you're overwhelmed because you're always fighting for services or rights or all these things that this lady was talking about, I can tell it's beating her down. She's beat down from the fight. My wife was uplifted in her advocacy for her kids. I'm going to give you one last example. My wife called me one time and she had taken the kids to the movies. And my son, Eric, was a little bit younger and he didn't understand at that time. Sometimes movies flicker or, and this happened in the movie theater. It started to flicker and he went ballistic, started screaming and ran out of the movie theater. And so my wife followed him out there and he was in the hall screaming and yelling. He was melting down ultimately. And so my wife went out there and just kind of sat down next to him and quietly talked to him. And a couple of people came up and kind of were looking at her. And she said, hey, if you'll wait around for a few minutes, I'd love to share with you what just happened. Right? She didn't look at these people who were staring, because staring is normal when you see some 16-year-old kids screaming and yelling like a maniac, right? I mean, and that's what they do. It was a full-blown meltdown. He was laying on the floor, kicking and screaming. And she was just sitting down next to him and consoling him kindly. And they were staring. And that's what people do. And she said, hey, give me a few minutes. I'll solve this. And I'll tell you what's happening, right? And so after a few minutes, he kind of calmed down and she was able to console him and say, listen, it's okay. The movie's back on and it's going to work. And she was able to walk him back in and she came back out and there was a few people waiting and they wanted to know what the crap happened, right? And at that moment, she had a chance to do some autism awareness, right? In the kind and loving way, she said, you know what? Sometimes kids that are on the autism spectrum, when things happen, they get overstimulated and they melt down. And that's what happened. He started to melt down. He ran out of the theater. He was kind of freaking out. And that's a meltdown. And I was able to help him overcome that and get him back in the theater. And she said, that's what you saw. And she said, that's kind of what's happening. So next time you see that, you'll know that child may have or may be on the autism spectrum. And they said, oh, okay. Thank you for sharing that with us. And when I got home that day, she shared this story with me with a smile on her face, right? Because this is autism awareness in a loving and kind way, right? If somebody stares at us and we start screaming at them, that's hate. That's fight, and that can exhaust you. But when I got home and she told me this story, she had the biggest smile on her face. And she appreciated the opportunity to share that with those people. And they appreciated the opportunity to be a little bit more aware. My wife wasn't upset. She was staring. Staring is natural when you see something unusual. We can act like it's not, but it is. And she had an opportunity to do some wonderful, beautiful, loving, and kind autism awareness for these folks. And I'm sure they went and told that story. So my challenge for you is this. Take me up on this offer. The next time you think you need to fight for autism awareness or services or rights, decide not to fight and decide to love. And whatever that means to you, do that. Go in it with a spirit of love. Treat others with kindness. Treat others with compassion. Watch what happens to them. Watch what happens to you. The exhaustion will go away. The happiness in your life will increase. And that's what I want for you. I want you to be happy. I want your kids to see you be happy. That's what they need to see. They need to see us modeling kindness and happiness. And that'll make our kids better. It'll give them a better life. It'll give us a better life. Hopefully that's helpful. Sorry for the emotions, guys. I need to grab a tissue. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.